For this lecture, we are going to be talking about focal point. Now, this is one of the most important concepts of the class, and it's also just generally one of the most important concepts in visual art and any sort of visual design that you are doing, is creating a clear focal point. Okay? So you want to create a focal point that is super clear to the viewer. You want someone to be able to look at something you've created, whether it's even just a quick sketch or a finished piece of digital artwork, and you want people to know what your focal point is. So the focal point is what you want people to look at first and spend the most time on looking in your composition. So a very simple example may just be a portrait of a person. Okay, so if I was just to draw this portrait of this little weird dude, let's give him some spiky hair. Okay, so what is the focal point here? Here, the guy's face is the focal point. Okay, so there's our focal point. Okay, I don't really care if people look over here at the bushes. It's just kind of nice additions, extra details, birds flying in the sky maybe. But what this image is about and what I want people to look at is the focal point of the person's face. So when we look at art, we will always try and figure out what is the focal point. What do people want us to look at when we look at a given image? You can have more than one focal point, but for us, for the most part, we will be creating art with one single focal point. So you should always think of a focal point as you are making a piece of art. So the best way to make your focal point clear is before you even start drawing, before you put your pen or your pencil on the paper, know your focal point. Okay? It happens often where I'm looking at someone's sketches, and it could be a nice drawing of, scenery or whatever it may be, but my question is, what's the focal point? And then the student may shrug or they may say, I don't know. So if you don't know your focal point, then the viewer is not going to know your focal point, okay? So that is going to be a really good way to start this process of designing a focal point, is to know it first. So if I was to start this drawing, I would say, I want that guy's face to be the focal point. Okay, so maybe I would be doing a drawing of a sailboat. And I know in my head, before I start drawing, I want this boat to be the focal point. Okay, so now the boat is the focal point here. Okay, these mountains are fine. They're kind of interesting shapes, but the purpose of this drawing is to look right there at that focal point. Okay? All right, so a good way to make your focal point clear is to use value and extreme values. So really dark values or really light values, which that's white right there. Okay, so let's start with a black value example. So let's just make an abstract composition here. Okay, so that right now there is not really a focal point in here. There's not really a clear focal point. And again, make sure you guys have your sketchbooks out. You're sketching along with me. Pausing the video if I draw a little too quick to just kind of catch up. Okay. So what is the focal point here? We don't really know. So all I have to do is use that dark value to make one of these stand out. So all I have to do is color in this one dark. Now we have a clear focal point. Our eye is going to be drawn to that dark shape. So I've mentioned to some of you guys as comments on your discussion pieces, really good dark values, or you need to use darker values because students are usually hesitant to really make that dark mark on their paper. So a really good place to use those dark values is on a focal point. So yeah, that'll help you guys to make that focal point stand out. You can also do the opposite of this. So for the most part, the composition here, let's say in this number 1, go number 2 here. Number 1, most of this is light value. It's almost all white, right? So that dark value will stand out. So let's say you have a dark composition. Draw this line. And you have dark shapes in here. Maybe you have some medium value shapes. This is another abstract composition. Okay. So you have a mix. So I have all these kind of lines. Let's say I want one of these lines to be the focal point. How do I make that one the focal? What value should I make the focal point line here to make one of these lines stand out? A bright white. So now that one becomes the clear focal point. So when you look at it just quickly, using a very extreme dark value or an extreme light value will really help your focal point to stand out. So this is called value contrast. It's basically the biggest difference in value will stand out to the viewer. So we're going to come back to value contrast number of different times throughout the quarter. This is just kind of introducing this idea of value contrast and using an extreme dark value or an extreme light value to make that focal point stand out. Okay? So that's one good way to make the focal point stand out. Another thing that will help us make our focal point stand out are leading lines. Leading lines. Okay. A very simple idea, but something that can be used in a number of different ways to make something stand out. So let's say we have a shape right here is our focal point. Let's make it dark. So when you're making your focal point stand out to your viewer, you almost want to like hit the viewer over the head with it. You just want to make it so clear of what that focal point is that they don't get confused. You never want to confuse your viewer when they are looking at your work, okay? So leading lines are literally arrows, or not necessarily arrows, but they act like arrows that points at a certain shape. So this arrow points at that shape. So I'm just going to have a bunch of lines come in here. Now they are lines that just lead your eye, usually right to the focal point. So they don't always go right at the focal point. There are some examples where leading lines kind of move your eye just around the composition. But for our purposes and most of the art we are making, you can think about adding leading lines in that way. So now we got a clear focal point right here. And now all of these are basically acting as just little arrows leading the viewer's eye to that focal point. Okay, so that is really a good way to help make it clear. So you can do this for abstract compositions or representational. So another abstract one, because you can use literal lines. You can also use shapes and things like that. So let's just make a little abstract composition, stack up some curved lines here. Create a little stack. I'm going to just put my focal point on this little pedestal here. So there's a focal point. Okay, so start off, I'm going to use some value, then color that in dark. All right, so I want to make this just more clear to my viewer. I mean, it's pretty clear right now. But we want to practice using these lines so when you do get into leading lines, so when you do get into more complex compositions, it will be easier. So let's just start out. I'm going to have some lines here. Boom, pointing right there at that guy. So there, we got some literal lines. Let's do some shape repetition. So I'm just going to kind of repeat the shape of these circles, now that creates a little trail as a leading line. Okay? I can also use triangular type shapes that are literally like little points of the arrow down there. And I even kind of like these curvy lines I have. I'm going to repeat a few more of those up into there. Overlap. All right, so now when we analyze this piece, it's very abstract, pretty simple for the most part. Focal point. Now we got this as a leading line down to there. These are little arrows from the corner. Literal lines coming from the edge, and then these nice soft curves kind of curve up there. Okay, so I'm using value first to make it stand out, and then I'm adding in shapes, repeating shapes, and leading lines as well. Okay, so it's pretty, easy when you're doing abstract because you don't have to make these lines be a actual thing. All you have to do is make lines and shapes. But when you're working representationally, it can be a little bit more complicated. So there's a couple types of lines that you can use when working representationally. So sight lines and perspective lines. So let's go over sight lines first. So sight lines are lines created by people's vision. So if you have characters or people in your composition, so I got this guy here, he got his eyes like this. His eyes look over this way at now a representational focal point. Okay, so this, it's not a literal line, it's an imaginary line, but it's created by the vision of a character within your scene or within your composition. So this can be done with actors or models if you're doing film or photography, or obviously with drawings if you're illustrating or creating a drawing with something. So let's start here. Let's create a little quick example. Let's have a balloon in the sky be our focal point. A dark shape. So already dark shape's going to help it stand out. That little thread is kind of a leading line, which is nice. Okay. But now I can put in some people down here. So this is the same sort of phenomenon that'll happen if you're ever, out walking along the street. And there's like a bunch of people looking up and pointing up at something. Most likely, you are also going to look up at whatever that thing is. So the same thing works in a drawing or a photograph. My really well drawn people here. Let's put a little context in this. Just put them on the ground here. Maybe put like some buildings or something here in the background. Cool. All right, so now we have all the sight lines of these three characters going up to the balloon. I'm going to raise this guy's arm. This will create another shape leading up to that balloon. Maybe add in some clouds. It's another leading line. Okay, so now we got boom, focal point. Sight line up there. Sight line. Sight line. Got the arm as a leading line. A little trail from our balloon, our little string. Cloud. Cloud. So everything's drawing our eye, drawing our vision up to that balloon there. Okay. So we'll look at some examples in a sec to see how some artists have pulled off the sight lines before. So again, it's possible to just kind of work those in there when you're doing representational work. It just takes a little bit more creativity to kind of figure that out. All right. So perspective lines. So you guys, you guys may be familiar with perspective drawings. We'll do a little bit in this class later on. But linear perspective is just kind of making things look 3D. So it's using these lines to make that cube look 3D. You may have seen perspective lines other times. If you're looking down like a hallway, you have lines like this. These are perspective lines. So you got your lamps along the top, some doors along the wall here, maybe some windows. And then you can put your focal point right there in the middle, and now all these lines lead to the focal point. So that's basically the idea here. You see it when you like look down railroad tracks going off into the distance. So I'm going to do one where we're out here on the open road. A car is my focal point. Wheels down here. Okay. You can make it a dark car, dark value. So we start off good, making it stand out. Let me make it a little bit smaller, actually. So yeah, especially when you have a small focal point, leading lines help a lot more, so your viewers don't get, lose whatever that focal point is. Okay, there is my roadway going off into the distance. Okay, so now we got the road. These are the perspective lines, but now we can get kind of creative. Let's put some like hills in the background as well. Okay, you can put some like cracks here in the road that lead up to the viewer, or lead the viewer's eye to the car. Let's do some lampposts here, as these can kind of act as those repeated shapes that we did in the abstract version. And maybe some grasses here on this side. Okay. And I lots of times use clouds because you can make clouds any shape you want. No real rules about that. So now, let's look at this and analyze it. Focal point. Boom. Leading line. Obviously those perspective lines. The lines along the road, the cracks, the tops of our lamps, edge of the mountains here, and clouds. So now everything, again, drawing our eye to that focal point. All right, let's do one more quick representational example, and then we will look at some other artists that use leading lines. Okay, so here we go. We'll use this example probably more than once in this quarter, but I like this one. So everyone draw this in your sketchbook. Okay, just draw that blank house. So we want this house to be the focal point. Dark value. A little chimney. Similar house from our silhouette design we were talking about the other day. Okay, so draw that. Pause the video if you need to. And just kind of think about and brainstorm some different things that we could use as leading lines here. Okay, so what could we use? We could use some clouds, obviously. Could use some wires. Maybe a path. Maybe other hills in the distance. We could use sight lines, a person. Okay. So now let's add in. So just take a second before I do it. Why don't you add these things to your drawing and see what you come up with, and you can kind of compare it to my version. So as I do it, I'm just going to add in a path here. Some other hills in the distance. Chimney smoke, I oftentimes use chimney smoke. It's a very simple thing to make leading lines. Sight lines, I'm just going to put a guy walking and pointing here. Walking up to that house. What else do we got? Oh, let's think of path wires. Got some little wires coming off here to a telephone pole. I use wires a lot for leading lines as well. You can do a fence. This is just another one I came up with. Okay, so there's lots of different things you could do here to be creative. So really it just takes kind of careful planning it out and doing these different sorts of drawings. All right, let's look at some artists that have used leading lines really quick. So maybe you guys have seen the movie The Shining. Okay, so this is a really good horror movie starring Jack Nicholson. Great movie if you ever have a chance to see it, but really good cinematography in here. So this is kind of what we'll do to analyze work. So I'm going to ask you guys, what is the focal point here? What is the focal point in this composition? That is always a good question to ask yourself. What is the focal point? Well, dead giveaway when it's a person. Usually it's the people, and usually it's their faces. Okay, so this one uses perspective lines here. So this is, they don't have to come up with a drawing. This is all about where is the camera, what's the angle of the camera, where do you place the actors, and what kind of sets are you using to get those leading lines. So same idea there, but putting them in the middle. Leading lines drawing the eye to the focal point. So what's cool about that movie is they use similar type of composition a lot. You can see another version here, focal point in the middle, and then leading lines here. So they use this kind of same composition throughout the film over and over and over again. Kind of becomes a stylistic choice. Okay, now the master of it, Norman Rockwell. We will look a lot at his artwork throughout this quarter. So he's a master illustrator, worked in the early 1900s, things like that. So what is the focal point here? What is the focal point? Can you guys tell? Kind of has more than one. So we kind of have the face of the kids and then the face of the parents. So what leading lines do you guys see in here? Where are some leading lines to draw our eyes to the focal points? He uses sight lines a lot and uses them very effectively. So look at this, kind of bounces our eyes down to there. That's the main reason I say that the kids are the main focal point, because the parents' eyes are drawing down to there. And then there's just kind of a lot. So this shadow draws us down to the focal point. The bed leads us across. The whole man's body kind of leans us up, and then to his eyes, and then back down. Okay, so you can see everything in here, even the edge of this chair, kind of leads us up to there. So everything in here is really carefully composed. It just takes a lot of planning and a lot of really good composition design to figure that out. Here's one by N.C. Wyeth. So what is the focal point here? We're going to count this guy as the primary focal point, meaning the most important one. This guy's also a bit of a focal point here. Now this composition, this is N.C. Wyeth, another illustrator. I think this is from Treasure Island. And here we have a lot of stuff going on to use for leading lines. So where he set this drawing, obviously there's lots of ropes and lines in this scene going up and down to the focal point. We have the sight lines of the two characters going back and forth. Let me do that one as a dotted line since it's not a literal line. And yeah, so there's a lot of stuff in here in this composition drawing us to that focal point. This whole character's body is a big leading line as well. So it's really just bouncing our vision back and forth between those two characters. Oh, and I like this very subtle one of these birds that leads us up to that character there. Okay, so this is a very good thing to do when you look at people's artwork still frames from films. So see if you can start to try and figure that out, or look for that when you're looking at artwork and looking at different compositions. So that is the main idea for knowing your focal point and then reinforcing that focal point to the viewer. You want it to be extra clear to the viewer so they always know what the focal point is. Make it clear to your viewer and make it stand out. Okay, so our drawing challenge this week will deal with creating a composition that uses some leading lines, and this is something I will be looking for on every project, Project 2, Project 3, and Project 4 for the rest of the quarter.